Part 2, Chapter 7 of Mushrooms on the Moor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lillis. Mushrooms on the Moor by Frank W. Boreham. Part 2, Chapter 7. Tramp, Tramp, Tramp. 1. Tramp, 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 tramp. It was like the regular and rhythmic beat of a great machine. File after file, column after column, I watched the troops pass by. Tramp, 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 tramp. On they went, and on, all in perfect time and step. Tramp, 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 tramp. It reminded me of that haunting passage that tells us that all these men of war that could keep rank came with a perfect heart to make David king over all Israel. They could keep rank. It's a suggestive record. There is more in it than it appears on the surface. They could keep rank. Right, left, tramp, 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 tramp. All these men of war that could keep rank came with a perfect heart to make David king over all Israel. 2. Half of the art of life lies in learning to keep step. It is a great thing, a very great thing, to be able to get on with other people. Let me indulge in a little autobiography. I once had a most extraordinary experience, an experience so altogether amazing that all subsequent experiences appear like the veriest commonplaces in comparison. The fact is, I was born. Such a thing had never happened to me before, and I was utterly bewildered. I did not know what to make of it. My first impression was that I was all alone, and that I had the solar system all to myself. Like Robinson Crusoe, I fancied myself monarch of all I surveyed. But then, like Robinson Crusoe, I discovered a footprint, and found that the planet on which I had been so mysteriously cast was inhabited. There were two of us, myself and the other fellow. As soon as I could devise means of locomotion, I set out, like Robinson Crusoe, to find out what the other fellow was like. I had a kind of instinct that sooner or later I should have to fight him. I found that he differed from me in one essential particular. He had hundreds of millions of heads. I had but one. He had hundreds of millions of feet, hundreds of millions of hands, hundreds of millions of ears and eyes. I had but two. But for all that, it never occurred to me that he was greater than I. Myself always appeared to me to be vastly more important than the other fellow. It was nothing to me that he starved so long as I had plenty of food. It was nothing to me that he shivered so long as I was wrapped up snugly. I do not remember that it ever once crossed my mind in the first 6 months of my existence that it would be a bad thing if he died, with all his hundreds of millions of heads, and left me all alone upon the planet. I was first, and he was nowhere. I was everything, and he was nothing. Why, dear me, I must have cut my first teeth before it occurred to me that there was room on the planet for both of us. And I must have cut my wisdom teeth before I discovered that the world was on the whole more interesting to me because of his presence in it. And since then I have spent some pains, in a blundering, unskilful kind of way, in trying to make myself tolerable to him. And the longer I live, the more clearly I see that, although he is an odd fellow at times, he is very quick to respond to and reciprocate such advances. He is discovering, as am I, that walking in step has a pleasure peculiar to itself. 3. I said a moment ago that half the air of life lies in learning to keep step. Conversely, half the tragedy of life consists in our failure to do so. Here are Mr. and Mrs. Cardew. All lovers of Mark Rutherford know them well. They were both of them really excellent people, a minister and his wife, deeply attached to one another, and yet as wretched could be. How are you going to account for it? It is vastly important just because it is so common. Domestic difficulties rarely arise out of downright wickedness. Husband and wife may be as free from all outward fault as poor Mr. and Mrs. Cardew. Mark Rutherford thinks that Mr. Cardew was chiefly to blame, and his verdict is probably just. A man takes a considerably longer stride than a woman, but for all that it is still possible, even in these days of hobble-skirts, for man and maid to walk in step, as all true lovers know. But it can only be managed by his moderating his ungainly stride to her more modest one, and perhaps by her unconsciously lengthening her step under the invigorating influence of his support, which is a parable. Mark Rutherford says that, quote, Mr. Cardew had not learned the art of being happy with his wife. He did not know that happiness is an art. He rather did everything he could to make the relationship intolerable. He demanded payment in coin stamped from his own mint, and if bullion and jewels had been poured before him he would have taken no heed of them. He did not take into account that what his wife said and what she felt might not be the same, that persons who have no great command over language are obliged to make one word do for a dozen, and that if his wife was defective at one point, there were in her whole regions of unexplored excellence, of faculties never encouraged, and an affection to which he offered no response." End quote. There is more philosophy in the cunning way in which the happy lovers in the lane accommodate their strides to the comfort of each other than we have been accustomed to suspect. It is done very easily. It is done almost unconsciously. But they must be very careful to go on doing it long after they have left the leafy old lane behind them. 4. I do not mean to suggest that husbands and wives are sinners above all people on the face of the earth. By no means. Is there a club, a society, an office, or a church in the wide, wide world that does not shelter a most excellent individual whose one and only fault is that he cannot get on with anybody else? That is, of course, my way of putting it. It is not his. He would say that nobody else can get on with him. Which again takes our minds back to the troops. A raw Scotch lad joined that expeditionary force, and on the first parade day his mother and sister came proudly down to see him march. Jock, sad to say, was out of step. At least that's my way of putting it. But it is not the only way. "Look, mother," said his fond sister. "Look, they're out of step but our Jock." It is not for me to decide whether Jock is right or whether the others are. But since the others are all in step with each other, I'm afraid the presumptive evidence is rather heavily against Jock. And Jock is well known to all of us. Nobody likes him, and nobody knows why they don't like him. In many respects he is a paragon of goodness. He loves his church, or he would not have stuck to it year in and year out as he has done. He is not self-assertive. He is willing to efface his own personality and be invisible. He is generous to a fault. Nobody is more eager to do anything for the general good. And yet nobody likes him. The only thing against him is that he has never disciplined himself to get on with other people. He has never tried to accommodate himself to their stride. He can't keep rank. They're out of step but our Jock. Poor Jock. 5. I know that out of all this a serious problem emerges. The problem is this: why should Jock destroy his own personality in order to render himself an exact replica of every other man in the regiment? Is individuality an evil thing that must be wiped out and obliterated? The answer to this objection is that Jock is not asked to sacrifice his personality. He is asked to sacrifice his angularity. The ideal of British discipline is not to turn men into machines, but to preserve individuality and initiative, and yet, at the same time, to make each man of as great value to his comrades as is by any means possible. In the church we do the same. Brown means well, but he is all gush. You ask him to do a thing. "Oh, certainly, with the greatest pleasure in the world." But you have an awkward feeling that he will undertake 1,000 other duties in the same airy way, and that the chances of his doing the work and doing it well are not rosy. Smith, on the other hand, is cautious. He, too, means well, but he is unduly scared of promising more than he can creditably fulfill. And, as a matter of fact, this bogey frightens him out of doing as much as he might and should. Now here you have Brown running and Smith crawling. You know perfectly well that Brown will exhaust himself quite prematurely, and that Smith will never get there. And between Brown's excited scamper and Smith's exasperating crawl, the main host jogs along at a medium pace. Now Brown's personality is a delightful thing. You can't help loving him. His willingness is charming and his enthusiasm contagious. And Smith's steady persistence and extreme conscientiousness are most admirable. They do us all good. But if, whilst preserving and developing their personalities, we could strip them of their angularities and get them to walk in step at one steady and regular pace, tramp, 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 we should surely stand a better chance of making David high king over all Israel. 6. It is all a matter of discipline. The ploughman comes up from the country with a long, ungainly stride. The city man, accustomed to crowded pavements, comes with a short and mincing step. They are drilled for a fortnight side by side, and away they go. Right, left, tramp, 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 tramp. The harmony is perfect. Jock must submit himself to the same rigid process of training. He must be firmly convinced that the stride of the regiment is too short or too long. But if on that ground he adopts a different one, nobody but his gentle and admiring sister will believe that he is right and they are wrong. Jock's isolated attitude invariably reflects upon himself. "The whole regiment is out of step," he declares, drawing attention to his different stride. That is too often the trouble with Jock. "The members of our church do not read their Bible," he says. It may be sadly true, but it sounds, put that way, like a claim that he is the one conscientious and regular Bible reader among them. "The members of our church do not pray," he exclaims sadly. It may be that a call to prayer is urgently needed, but poor Jock puts the thing in such a light that it appears to be a claim on his part that he alone knows the way to the throne of grace. "Among the faithless, faithful only he." "The members of our church are not spiritually minded," he bemoans. But somehow, as he says it, it sounds suspiciously like an echo of little Jack Horner's "What a good boy am I!" In the correspondence of Elizabeth Fry there occurs a very striking and suggestive passage. When Mrs. Fry began to meet with great success in her work among the English prisons, some of the Quakers feared that her triumphs would engender pride in her own soul and destroy her spirituality. At last the thing became nauseous and intolerable, and she wrote, quote, "The prudent fears that the good have for me try me more than most things, and I find that it calls for Christian forbearance not to be a little put out by them. I am confident that we often see the Martha spirit of criticism enter in, even about spiritual things. O Lord, enable us to keep our ranks in righteousness." End quote. Tramp, 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 tramp. 7. And Enoch walked with God, and Noah walked with God, and Abraham walked with God, and Moses walked with God. Tramp, 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 tramp. All these men of war that could keep rank came with a perfect heart to make David king over all Israel. O Lord, enable us to keep our ranks in righteousness. End of Part 2, Chapter 7 of Mushrooms on the Moor.